Across Africa, citizens participate in public life in various ways, including voting, attending community meetings, contacting officials, and joining collective actions. But whether people engage often depends on how they see and experience their democratic institutions. Afrobarometer's 2025 flagship report shows a clear pattern. Citizens who believe their elections are free and fair, and who view their leaders as trustworthy and responsive, are far likely to get engaged. In contrast, where citizens question the credibility of elections or doubt their concerns will be heard or addressed, participation tends to decline. These differences in engagement are not as a result of apathy. They reflect whether citizens believe their involvement will produce results.
Welcome to Voices Africa, a podcast from Afrobarometer. I'm your host, Shannon van Wyk Kossa. Afrobarometer's 2025 flagship report highlights a consistent relationship between democratic quality, trust, and participation. Citizens who trust their leaders and who see their elections as credible engage more actively in civic and political life. Those who express low trust or don't think they can make their leaders listen, who are dissatisfied with the way their democracy is working, tend to participate less, except in protest marches. This sheds light on a central question. If a healthy democracy relies on active citizen involvement, what strategies can be implemented to encourage and enhance that participation? In today's episode, we explore this question using Afrobarometer data. Everyday examples drawn from across the continent and insights from researchers who study public trust and democratic performance. Before we dive deeper, a quick note about who we are and where these insights come from. Afrobarometer is a pan-African research network that has, for more than 2 decades, worked to amplify the voices of ordinary Africans. Through nationally representative surveys across about 40 African countries, Afrobarometer collects reliable data on citizens' thoughts, experiences, and preferences on a wide range of issues that affect their lives. We share our findings in publications, reports, news releases, and social media posts so that people's voices can become part of evidence-based policy and decision-making. Our 2025 flagship report, which informs this podcast series, focuses on how people participate in democracy. It captures the full spectrum of participation, from voting and contacting leaders to community meetings, protests, and online activism.
Across many of the 39 African countries surveyed by Afrobarometer, we find that citizens are more willing to engage if they think their leaders will listen and respond. This might be addressing service delivery concerns, holding consultations, or providing regular updates on community issues. Afrobarometer data provides specifics. Respondents who perceive their local leaders as responsive are more likely to attend community meetings and contact their elected local officials. At the same time, the survey shows that low trust in elected leaders is associated with reduced participation. In countries where citizens doubt the credibility of elections or question whether leaders are listening to their concerns, engagement declines across several activities. This is not disengagement driven by disinterest. It is a practical assessment of whether participation will make a difference. These patterns appear across diverse contexts, signaling that the link between institutional performance and participation is central to democratic life.
To gain a deeper understanding of these dynamics, I spoke with Dr. Kojo Asante, a scholar of democratic governance and citizen engagement. Dr. Asante is the Director of Policy Engagement and Partnerships at the Center for Democratic Development in Ghana. He brings more than 20 years of experience working to promote democracy, election integrity, the rule of law, and anti-corruption in Ghana and across Africa. A legal policy and governance specialist, Kojo leads CDD's political governance, rule of law, Accountability and Anti-Corruption Cluster, overseeing work on issues such as election integrity, the monetization of politics, anti-corruption, and constitutional and local government reform. He also oversees CDD's international desk, which focuses on research and analysis of global actors in Africa and the implications for democratic governance. Kojo holds a PhD in Development Policy and Management from the University of Manchester and a master's degree in Africana Studies from the State University of New York, Albany. A trained barrister, he is a member of the Ghana Bar Association, the Bar of England and Wales, and the Honourable Society of Gray's Inn. He has also been a Hewlett Fellow at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs at Harvard University and has consulted for organizations including the Overseas Development Institute, Adam Smith International, the Commonwealth Secretariat, and the Basel Institute on Governance. Kojo, thank you so much for joining us on the Voices Africa podcast. Afrobarometer's 2025 flagship report links citizen engagement to democratic performance. Can you explain a little bit more about that relationship and the mechanism behind that?
First of all, it's a very, very important report. And I think this linkage is so important for Africa's still very nascent democratic experiment. But I think the basic argument is that, the more you are able to get citizens to engage with the political process, whether or not they are voting, they are protesting, they are attending sort of community meetings or contacting their leaders, the more you have a thriving democracy, because that form of expression and engagement is what allows citizens to communicate their preferences and their needs to their duty bearers or their leaders, who then can use that information to govern well and be effective in providing, the needs of the people, basically facilitating development. I think that link is very true in many sense, and the report really tries to capture that mechanism.
And for you, what are the costs or the risks of declining citizen engagement?
I think you pay the ultimate price for sort of ignoring or having a very weak engagement of citizens, because as we have seen in a number of places, particularly in West Africa, there's a return of coup d'etats. So if people are not engaged in voting, they are not, reaching out to their local leaders, they are not organizing with other people to sort of communicate their needs, then they would find expression elsewhere. One of the, I think, good insights is that where you have, I think the flagship report talks about where people have faith in the electoral process, believe the election is free and fair, and they participate, you have less protest, for example. So I think you really pay the ultimate price if you are not facilitating civic engagement.
I think you've picked up on a really interesting point there, and I just want to shift to the conversation around trust in institutions. Particularly, how does public trust in institutions affect whether citizens participate or withdraw? And if you have any specific examples that speak to that.
I think the report is very clear that the more responsive leaders are, for instance, I think one of the insights from the report was talk about why people would go to their local councillors, that, the more people believe that they would get a response from their local councillors, the more likely that they would actually contact them if they have any need for something. But the trust in institutions is fundamental. I think one of the things you see in the Afrobarometer over time is that there is really a decline in trust in state institutions generally, a certain lack of belief that state institutions can actually respond to the needs of people. And we've seen, even from the first flagship report, that, when you have things like flawed elections, it triggers, or at least is one of the biggest drivers of decline in support for democracy, and also lower levels of dissatisfaction with democracy. So that, issue of trust in the institutions of democracy is very important, from anti-corruption institutions to electoral management bodies to executive, particularly the presidency, checks and balance institutions like parliament, and so on.
You've touched on trust in institutions, particularly focusing on contacting local leaders. And I think my next question to you is, how can governments earn back that participation, particularly from a national point of view?
The fact that if a leader is more responsive or a government is more responsive, then you're likely to get more citizen engagement. And then if you get more citizen engagement, you're also likely to get more political participation and therefore stronger democracy. It's almost like the blueprint is there, right? But then it would mean that you have to create the enabling environment for that to happen. For example, you have to be able to free the civic space for people to be able to do this without, fear, without intimidation, without, any sort of impediments in their way to freely engage. I mean, one of the things the report talks about is more younger people now, of course, have access. I use the internet. I think 57% from the report. They are also expressing more online. And I'm sure some of these questions we begin to see more and more that the forms of participation and engagement are changing constantly. So when we talk about the civic space, it's about, also digital rights, online participation. How is that being protected and promoted, even in terms of regulation? Where's the balance between the free speech and also the issues of security and accountability of media and so on? So I think the blueprint or the pathway to earning back that trust and encouraging participation is there. You just have to deliver as a leader, but also ensure that the infrastructure for citizen engagement is well protected and built up.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've brought up a really interesting point about the civic space that currently exists. And my next question is focused on a citizen-centric view of engagement. Particularly, how can election observers and civic educators help build lasting engagement?
I think for observers, as I mentioned, for both the first report and in this report, so in this report, for example, voting is the biggest expression of public engagement. And that's great because, when you compare it to other places where they are declining, vote participation in elections, it's good that African citizens, African voters are actually still going to the polls because they do believe in the democracy project. Policing the vote is important. I think that can never be taken lightly. We have to ensure that there is independent citizen groups and actors that are able to pronounce on the credibility of the vote. But unfortunately, that particular action, that particular intervention is now being threatened by so many different efforts to suppress and weaken the civic space, even in terms of accreditation for observing elections. There are laws that are being passed around rights of association, so NGOs, regulations that are meant to cripple the ability. And we saw that in Uganda recently, where all these laws were introduced, cybersecurity laws, NGO laws, of course, general prosecutorial laws that are used to sort of clip. So it's not only about fighting to ensure that ordinary citizens can still police electoral processes, but to make sure that obnoxious laws and laws that impede that right is also, combated.
And on the other side of that, can you give us some examples that show democracy working well on the continent?
Oh, I like the example of Senegal. Because I think also sometimes when we think about democracy, it's this assumption that everything must always work well. I think the strength of a democracy is also its ability to overcome threats to that democracy. And I think in the Senegal case, when there was this attempted manipulation of elections to elongate the president's term, you saw the fight back from citizens. The good thing is that it's the whole of the citizenry, from academics to religious leaders to youth groups who resisted, went on the streets, and the courts played their role, the army played this role to say, no, we have to respect the constitutional order. So I like that. I think South Africa is always a good example of just always protecting the civic space for very vibrant civic engagement and protecting citizen rights and so on and so forth. So which always constantly create a very vibrant civic space, which I think then, makes a very strong democracy.
Thanks, Kojo. In closing, and I think you've touched on this just in your last answer, but we know that 2024 was the year of elections on the African continent. If you could summarize for us, what indicators are you usually watching for to judge whether democracy is delivering? So maybe if you can just round it up for us for kind of like 3 key indicators.
I think what we've seen, particularly 2024, yes, the year of election, what we've seen is that elections are not just about election days anymore. To have a credible election and therefore be able to signal that democracy is going to thrive, you have to look at the whole processes of electoral integrity, from, voter registration to campaigning, to the participation of opposition parties, to the civic space, citizens' ability to critique government, to participate in political activities, all the way to, logistics and how, everything is organized on election. And even in the post-election space, how the digital space is regulated or managed. For me, if there's one thing I can say, the indicator is that you have to just look at the whole phase of election, including even election adjudication, that's after the elections are held, to be able to understand whether or not that particular country democracy is going in the right direction.
The insights from Afrobarometer's 2025 flagship report highlight a central truth about democratic life. Citizen participation is closely tied to whether institutions perform effectively and fairly. Citizens remain engaged when they observe credible elections and leadership that is responsive, trustworthy, and effective. These elements signal that participation is meaningful. However, when institutions fail to meet expectations, when elections are perceived as unfair or unfree, and when leaders appear unresponsive, participation tends to decline. Democratic engagement is therefore not only about motivation or civic norms. It's about whether the system confirms that citizens' voices matter. Building and sustaining trust requires consistent effort from institutions at all levels. Even minor improvements, such as a timely response, a clear explanation, a transparent decision, can influence whether citizens choose to get involved. I'm Shannon van Wyk Kossa, and this has been Voices Africa, a podcast from Afrobarometer. In our final episode of the season, we look ahead to emerging trends, from digital organizing to urban participation, and explore what they mean for the future of civic life across the continent. To read the full Afrobarometer 2025 flagship report on citizen engagement, visit afrobarometer.org.